Hi, welcome to day 457. This weekend, we listened to a couple of audios, one of which was the code, and the other was a teaching from NTI 3 John and also from Jude. And Jude talked a lot about the perception of suffering and how suffering is not real. I want to share a story with you about the belief in suffering. It's a story about how I let go of the belief in suffering. I'm going to play a recording, or at least a portion of a recording. This recording was made within days of letting go of that belief. So my memory of the experience is very fresh. So I think it's good to listen to that. And then after we listen to the recording, I'll come back like Paul Harvey and I'll tell the rest of the story. So that your eyes have something to do while you're listening to the recording. I'm just going to show you some symbolic pictures that kind of go along with the story. So let me share my screen.
Good morning. This is Regina. I know it's been a while since I've done an RDA Today recording. There are two reasons for that. One is I was gone. I was in Israel for almost 2 weeks. And the second reason is when I returned from Israel, I became ill. The illness was interesting. It started off as what seemed to be just a cold. I hadn't had a cold in several years, so it was a bit of a surprise, but it was just a cold. But then on Monday of this week, about 2 p.m. in the afternoon, it seemed to turn, quite severe. A headache came on that I'm calling migraine-like, but it was not a migraine. In the past I've had migraines, so I know what they are. This was different. This was specifically related to this sickness, but it was very, very intense. And what I experienced was suffering that I would call shocking. What I noticed about this suffering was that it was so strong that I could not possibly deny it. In fact, when my roommate came home from work that day, what I said to her was, "Danielle, I am suffering." She was surprised to hear those words from me. There's also a picture of Jesus that hangs in my bedroom, which is where I was laying, and so I was looking at this picture of Jesus, and at one point I even heard myself calling out to Jesus, to that picture of Jesus as a symbol of grace. Help me. I noticed that when I was engaged in the suffering that I could not separate myself from it. And what I mean by that is often I have now a natural experience of observing the personality, observing the world, but not feeling like that's what I am. But during the suffering, even when I notice within me a desire to kind of shift away from it and look at it rather than be it, I couldn't seem to do that. Now, I'll keep the story short. I won't tell you all the wonderful things that happened in order to move me beyond the suffering. I'll just keep it brief by saying medication happened. Although the way the medication came about is an interesting story in itself, and I think maybe the answer to my request helped me. But we'll skip that story. That's not what's important now. What's important now is that the suffering did end around 2 a.m. the next day. So it lasted about 12 hours. And then after that I continued to remain sick but not suffering. And during the time that I was sick, what I noticed was that I felt more like Regina than I have in years. It's like, it was like somebody that I used to know was back. I could really feel her like I hadn't felt her in a long time. And there was even this, I remember now who she is and what she felt like. It's kind of like, for me, this awakening process has been almost a gradual fading of the personality. And so since the personality is fading gradually, it's not a spontaneous boom for me. Sometimes there's just not even a noticing of how much it's fading. But when she was back, I could remember who she was. And I recognized her. And I realized I didn't need her. I didn't want her. There was no judgment against her. It was just kind of a heaviness that didn't seem necessary. Last night, about 9 p.m., this would have been the third day of the illness, or the third day since the headache started anyway. I suddenly felt, you could say it was just like somebody lifted the veil off of me. Like in a moment, I suddenly knew I was well, that it was over. And I slept well last night. And I woke up this morning feeling incredibly light. Like a butterfly who has emerged from a cocoon. Both embraced by love and love itself. And with clarity and what I'm going to call for right now, purpose. There's kind of a knowing that I am being guided, moved in what I am to do, and that I will just do it. And it doesn't have any obstacles. No personality obstacle will get in the way. And I woke up this morning also seeing the sickness as an incredible gift. And I'm grateful for it. And so now this brings me to my topic. I suffered. I really suffered. I don't want to pretend like I didn't. And now I'm calling that a gift. So does that mean that God makes you suffer in order to awaken? The answer is no. God is not what made me suffer. I suffered because of a belief in my mind. Grace is what allowed me to see the belief. And grace somehow turned its love on it, and grace is now presently healing it. Let me explain by telling you a personal story. In the last couple of months, a few things have happened which have brought something to my attention. One thing that happened is that my mother found out that she needed bypass surgery on her heart. And after her surgery, I was talking to her, and she told me a story about how they had this tube, this fairly large tube that was going down her mouth and throat, and how for the most part the tube wasn't a problem because she was so heavily medicated that she didn't even notice it. But towards the end they knew they were going to take the tube out, and so they didn't renew the medication on schedule, and the medication began to wear off. And then this tube was in her, and it began to become extremely uncomfortable. She began to have the feeling of wanting to gag, but even the tube was in the way of her being able to gag. She wanted to rip the tube from her mouth, but her hands were tied down to the bed so that she wouldn't, because they knew that this was an automatic reaction. So there she was, if I remember correctly, for approximately 30 minutes in this position of suffering. And when she told me that story, I noticed an intense reaction in me, a fear of suffering. A couple days later, I was with a friend riding in the car, and he talked about his fear of death. And I told him, I said, I don't have a fear of death. I have a fear of suffering. And I knew when I said that I was speaking a truth, that I really had a fear of suffering. Then, during my 7 steps work one day, I found myself writing this: something is not healed in me. It is my perception of the worst, extreme suffering and unacceptable conditions. These I feel I do not want to be real. And this feeling comes from the fear that they are. It comes from the fear that the illusion of a spiritual reality stops here, where the absolute reality of suffering is too real to be denied. In other words, there was a belief in me that suffering was more real than truth, and that we could pretend truth was true as long as we weren't truly suffering. But when the physical pain became strong enough, there was no hope of a realization of truth, because the pain itself was more real. On my trip to Israel, we came across a calf who was suffering. He had some type of illness or something, and he was laying down, unable to get up, and he'd been abandoned by his mother because there was nothing she could do. And I didn't suffer any reaction from that. There was nothing in me that was really afraid for the cow or anything. I felt at peace the entire time we were with the cow. But I did want for him death. I felt that death was better than suffering. There's a duality there. You hear it? I felt that death was better than suffering. And there came the point where he had not yet died, and we had to leave him and move on. And I was sad. I noticed tears falling because he had not achieved the peace of death. And I had to leave him laying there suffering. All of this points to a theme that was in my mind. That belief that suffering was more real than truth, that belief is what brought on my own suffering, not God. In fact, to continue to look at my 7 Steps journal, item number 714A is where I talked about that the belief in suffering is not healed in me. Item 714B, I wrote, when a belief is in the mind, that belief is perceived. And when the suffering came during my illness, remember I told you I could not separate myself from it. There was a belief that suffering is more real than truth. And so when the suffering was present, it seemed that the awareness of truth could not be reached. It was unachievable. This was merely an experience brought about by a belief in the mind. Seven 14C in my journal says, when one believes what appears in the world, true seeing is blocked by the choice for false perception. This is what I had made, was a choice for false perception, and I was not seeing that I was consistently making that choice by continuing to fear suffering, by continuing to believe that suffering was more real than reality. (714D). The belief in an I who believes and perceives is the root of all false perception. Without an I to believe and perceive, what false perception could appear? I told you that even after the suffering ended, there seemed to be a strong presence of the Regina personality. This personality has been fading in me, but this personality is not dead. She's not dead because some of her beliefs, some of her fears are still present. And as long as there is even a smidgen of her left, then her remaining beliefs, remaining fears can be experienced. The only way to not experience what she believes, what she fears, is for there to be no her. Sometimes when things happen to people, they analyze them and they want to know what belief in me caused this. When I was sick, I knew intuitively not to analyze it. What I'm sharing with you now did not come about through analyzing. I knew that to think about it was actually to reinforce the personality. To think about it was to believe that the personality could come up with the answer. I still had that much clarity, even in the illness. But when I woke up this morning free of the illness, I suddenly understood what that belief was. It was given by grace, the seeing that it was the belief in suffering that I experienced. The seeing that this was still a part of the personality that was still attached or had not been let go or healed or seen through. And then there was also this incredible knowing that through my willingness, love was now looking on that belief and it was being healed or it was disappearing, that I do not need to fear suffering anymore because that fear itself is going to die. And when it dies, there can't be that experience of suffering being more real than reality. It cannot exist without the belief. I know that that is being taken care of now by grace. I know it so much that if you could feel the joy in my heart, it is as incredible, more incredible than the suffering was. It's so light.
That's all of that audio I'm going to play. And if you want to know where the rest of the audio is, it's actually a part of the Awakening Together Minister Preparation Program. It's a part of the True Discernment course. So if you take that course or if you've taken that course, that's where you run across that audio. But now what I want to do is tell the rest of the story. Because as I mentioned, that audio was recorded right then, right when I had woken up and realized, oh, there's this false belief in my mind that I've been believing. And really, it was the belief that suffering was more real than truth, that we could pretend all this airy-fairy truth stuff, spiritual stuff. But when the suffering hit the fan, that was undeniable. And this is really what NTI Jude was looking at, right? This belief in suffering. And it said there is no such thing as suffering. Well, what happened after this experience where you just heard the audio, this belief was exposed. Remember, we've learned awareness alone is curative. Well, this belief was exposed to awareness. Before then, it had been submerged in the subconscious. Once it was exposed, it healed on its own. What you're looking at now is a picture that was taken sometime later. I'm not sure how much later, 1 to 2 years later. I went skiing one day and I had an accident where I broke my wrist. And in fact, I didn't just break my wrist. The doctor said it was like a train wreck. My wrist was completely crushed. and I had to have surgery and have it replaced with an artificial wrist. Well, as you can imagine, the pain of having the wrist completely crushed was severe. Severe. What was amazing to me, this was my first experience after that belief of suffering had been taken away. What was amazing to me is it never, ever, ever touched my joy. The pain didn't. I felt the pain. In fact, when they took my arm one time and took it out of a sling and put it into some, maybe this cast or something, but they moved it, I almost passed out from the pain. There was a lot of pain, but the happiness was bigger. I don't know how to explain it. The happiness was what was more real. I mean, finally, the truth is more real than suffering. This is what I'm saying. The happiness, it never, ever, ever touched my joy. I never felt suffering. I felt pain. Joy was my experience, not suffering. So what I'm saying here is that through the code, through the experience of the code, we experience what we believe. We perceive what we believe, and it seems real. And if we keep focusing on it as if it's real, I know suffering's real. I suffered when I came back from Israel. We never transcend it. So what we're being asked to do now is we're being asked to see false beliefs as false and to focus our attention on the true. When we're in awareness, watching awareness meditation, we're focusing on the unaffected isness awareness. And this is what we're asked to do. If we keep focusing on our experience of the world as if it's true, we're going to keep having those same experiences. If I had focused on the suffering and said, okay, the suffering is what's real, I would have suffered again when I broke my wrist. You may have heard in the audio from NTI Jude, I talked about being thrown from a horse a couple weeks ago at that time. I was in Monument Valley and we were galloping, and I'm not very good at horseback riding. And the horses in front of me turned, and I didn't really have control of my horse, and it suddenly turned to follow those other horses. And when it turned, my body went straight and I hit the ground. And I hit the ground so hard, everything hurt. Everything hurt. And the thought crossed my mind that I might have broken my back, or that I might have broken my neck, that maybe everything had just now changed, that I was going to be paralyzed for the rest of my life. Two things happened. The first thing that happened, I had been practicing awareness, watching awareness meditation, and watching, noticing the isness, the awareness during the day, some of the walkabout exercises you've been doing. The first thing that happened when I hit the ground was I checked, and awareness was unchanged. Awareness was unaffected. That was just so automatic in me. So the body was in all of this pain, but the awareness was unaffected. And then the second thing I noticed is when that thought crossed my mind that maybe everything had just changed, that maybe I was going to be paralyzed for the rest of my life. The next thought was, well, I'll just have to learn how to be happy with that. I remember we had a leader, a group leader. And, of course, when I got thrown from the horse, he came running back, and you could see the fear and the worry on his face. I still at this point couldn't even move, didn't know if I would ever move again. And the pain was enormous. And I don't know if I actually smiled. I don't know what my face did, but I know there was this inner smile at least. And I told him not to worry. I was trying to help him not feel guilty. I let him know that I was okay, that everything was all right, all is well. That could only happen because the belief in suffering had died in me, because I knew that the truth was true and that my eyes were on the truth. So the reason I'm sharing all this is I want you to know that the teaching in NTI Jude is true. All we need to do is remove the false beliefs, and the way we perceive, the way we experience changes so drastically that you really can't explain it to people. So we're heading into NTI Revelation. You've already read NTI Revelation chapter 1. And what you'll be doing the next couple of days is listening to teachings from NTI First Revelation. And then we'll move forward. The focus of NTI First Revelation is the purification period, the letting go of false beliefs. So we're going to be looking at that because that's what needs to happen, right? I mean, when I let go of the belief in betrayal, I never perceived betrayal again. When I let go of the belief in rejection, I never perceived rejection again. When I let go of the belief in suffering, I never experienced suffering again. And when you let go of the belief in person, you don't experience persons anywhere. It's just consciousness. So this is all about letting go of the false. The experience of the real is natural. So again, NTI Revelation will be about that. So you'll also be doing some more reading further into NTI Revelation this week. You're going to be practicing awareness, watching awareness this week. This weekend, we are going to listen to another Leo video, the one I told you about last week, which was advanced tips for self-inquiry. And then you'll have an optional Leo video. It's one we watched very, very early in the 500 days about how to deal with difficult emotions. And, you know, when you're in purification, all these difficult emotions come up. So if you feel like you want to review that video, this is where we learn the superconductor process. If you feel you want to review that video this weekend, you may. That's an option. So I think that's all I have to share for today. So here we go into Revelation. Isn't this exciting? I'll see you next week. Bye.